persan 8 gravities. That was the number I gave command staff, in writing, with my professional seal attached to it. And I want you to understand that I did not pick that number out of fear or bias or the kind of casual species prejudice that gets filed away in your record for your entire career. I picked it because I ran the human cadet's skeletal density scan through the standard fracture threshold, model 4 separate times, and 4 separate times the model told me the same thing. His long bones would begin to spiral fracture at approximately 8.1 gravities of sustained radial force. I had the data. I had the tissue samples. I had 31 years of medical service across 6 different species and a shelf full of commendations for diagnostic accuracy. And none of that prepared me for what happened in Centrifuge Bay 3 on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, which is, I have since learned, a very human way to describe the day your entire understanding of a species gets taken out, back, and shot. My name is Dr. L. Pravas. At the time of this incident, I held the rank of Chief Medical Officer aboard the Joint Training Vessel Ascendant Compact, a vessel built by the Coalition specifically to integrate new member species into standardized officer training. I am Threll, which means very little to most of you listening, so let me give you the short version. My species evolved on a low-gravity world with a thin atmosphere and almost no large predators. Our bones are efficient, light, built for a world that never asked much of them. We are, by galactic standards, considered a moderately fragile species, and I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the entire point of this account. I built my career around understanding fragility. I understood it the way a locksmith understands locks. I could look at a skeletal scan and tell you, within a small margin of error, exactly where a body would break and exactly how much force it would take to break it there. So when Cadet Marcus Webb walked into my examination bay for his pre-centrifuge physical, I looked at his file, and I looked at him, and I felt something I can only describe now, with the benefit of hindsight, as quiet, professional pity. He was tall, not remarkably so by human standards I would later learn, but tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the bay's entry frame, which was calibrated for the average height of 6 different Coalition species, and apparently none of them were human. He had the kind of build humans call lean, which in my initial assessment translated to insufficient muscular padding around the joints. His skin was pale in a way that on most species I treated would have indicated some kind of circulatory deficiency, though I would later learn this was simply called being from a place named Minnesota, and that this was apparently a point of pride rather than concern. I ran the standard scan, bone density, joint tolerance, cardiovascular resilience, the works, and I sat there afterward, looking at the readout, feeling that particular flavor of professional frustration that comes from a species being new enough to the Coalition that we still don't have properly calibrated baseline models for them. Humanity had joined the Coalition 11 months prior. 11 months. In galactic terms, that is barely long enough to finish the paperwork, let alone properly understand a species' physiology, culture, or capabilities. We had 143 humans scattered across various training and diplomatic postings, and the medical division was still, frankly, guessing. We had inherited a set of provisional baseline values from an initial survey team, and those values told me that humans possessed a skeletal architecture roughly comparable to a mid-tier Coalition species, something in the range of what we classified as moderate durability, Tier 4 out of 9, with 9 being species like the Thracian ironhide who could shrug off small arms fire. Looking at Marcus Webb's scan, I did not think Tier 4. I thought Tier 2, maybe Tier 3, if I was being generous. His long bones showed a density reading that, when I ran it against our fracture models, gave him a theoretical tolerance ceiling somewhere around 8 to 9 gravities of sustained force before we would expect to see stress fractures propagating through the femur and along the vertebral column. Below that, discomfort, certainly, possibly, some soft tissue bruising. Above it, and I remember writing this in my notes with the kind of clinical detachment you learn to cultivate after 3 decades of practice. Above it, catastrophic structural failure was probable. I called him in to go over the results. I want to walk you through this conversation in detail because I think it tells you everything about who I was before that day and who I had to become afterward. Cadet Webb, I said, gesturing for him to sit on the examination bench, which groaned slightly under a weight it clearly was not expecting. "I've completed your pre-centrifuge assessment. I want to talk to you about the results before you proceed to the training schedule." "Sure," he said. He had this way of speaking that I would come to recognize as fairly typical of humans in professional settings, a kind of relaxed brevity that read, to my species, as either supreme confidence or a complete failure to grasp the seriousness of the situation. At the time I assumed the latter. "Your skeletal density profile," I said, pulling up the scan on the shared display between us, "places you in a lower durability tier than most coalition species, your approximate size and mass. Based on our current fracture threshold modeling, I would advise extreme caution regarding any centrifuge exercise that exceeds 8 gravities of sustained force." He glanced at the scan. "Not for very long, maybe 2 seconds. "Okay," he said. "I want to be clear about what that means," I continued, "because, in my experience, patients who say, 'okay,' that quickly have not actually processed the information. At sustained loads above that threshold, the model predicts spiral fracturing, beginning in the femur, likely propagating to the tibia and potentially the lumbar vertebrae, depending on posture and orientation within the arm. This is not a minor injury. This is the kind of structural failure that, without immediate medical intervention, can result in permanent mobility impairment." "Understood," he said. "The standard training protocol for new cadets caps the introductory centrifuge exercise at 6 gravities, specifically to build a margin of safety," I told him. "Given your profile, I'm going to recommend to your training officer that your cap be set at 5, possibly 4.5, until we have more data on human skeletal resilience specifically." And here is where he said the thing that I wrote down afterward word for word, because something about it snagged in my mind, even though I did not yet understand why. "With respect, Doctor, I'd like to request the opposite. I want the dial pushed as high as it'll go." I remember blinking at him. I do not have eyelids in the way most of you would picture, but I have an equivalent structure, and I remember it doing something equivalent to blinking. "Cadet Webb, did you hear the part where I described spiral fracturing?" "I heard it," he said. "I'd still like to request the full range test, past the safety cutoffs if command will authorize it. I want you to understand how unusual this request was. In 31 years of practice, across 6 species, I had never once had a patient ask me to remove a safety limitation I had personally recommended. Most patients, when informed of a serious medical risk, do one of 2 things. They accept the limitation gracefully, or they argue that the limitation is too conservative and ask for a modest increase. Nobody asks to skip past every intermediate safety threshold directly to the theoretical maximum of the equipment. That request would need to go through your training officer and the vessel's chief safety officer," I told him. "And frankly, Cadet, I would not support it. My professional recommendation would be a hard cap well below your projected fracture threshold, not an authorization to exceed it." "I understand that's your recommendation," he said, and there was nothing combative in his voice, nothing that read to me as arrogance or bravado, which is, I think, what threw me the most. He said it the way you might tell someone you preferred a different route to a destination. "I just think the model's wrong." "The model is based on your own skeletal density scan," I said, "the one I performed 20 minutes ago." "I know," he said. "I still think it's wrong. I did not know, at that moment, that I was having the single most important conversation of my medical career. I thought I was having a slightly odd conversation with an overconfident cadet who did not understand the difference between courage and physics." I told him I would document his request and that it would go up the chain to Commander Thessaly Rook, our training division supervisor, and to Chief Safety Officer Padrin Yulish, and that both of them would almost certainly deny it on my recommendation. I was wrong about that too, but we'll get there. Let me back up for a moment and give you some context about the Ascendant Compact and about why this particular test on this particular day mattered as much as it did. The Ascendant Compact was, at the time, one of only 4 coalition vessels running an integrated multi-species officer training program. Most coalition species trained separately within their own home fleets and only joined mixed crews after a substantial amount of individual assessment and certification. The integrated program was new, controversial in some circles, and closely watched by a number of very senior officials who wanted to know whether it was actually possible to train multiple species side by side using a single standardized curriculum, or whether the physiological and cultural differences humanity's presence in the program was, itself, a point of significant internal debate. There were factions within the Coalition Military Command who believed humans, given their short time as members and their unusual, still poorly understood physiology, should be held to a separate, more cautious training track until we had gathered several years of baseline data. There were other factions who argued that humans had already demonstrated in a handful of scattered incidents during their brief membership a level of resilience and adaptability that suggested they were being systematically underrated, and that holding them back was both scientifically unjustified and, frankly, a little insulting. I did not have a strong opinion on this debate before the centrifuge test. I want to be honest about that. I was a medical officer. My job was not to have opinions about political classifications. My job was to look at bodies and tell people what those bodies could and could not survive. I trusted my instruments. I trusted my models. I had built 31 years of professional reputation on the fact that when Dr. Elpra Voss told you a threshold, that threshold held. The centrifuge bay itself was, and I assume still is, an enormous cylindrical chamber near the ventral section of the ship, built around a rotating arm 42 meters in length with a sealed capsule at the far end. Cadets would be secured into the capsule, and the arm would spin, generating centrifugal force that simulated the gravitational load of high acceleration maneuvers, planetary descent under adverse conditions, or combat evasive action. It was, by design, one of the more brutal pieces of training equipment on the ship, because it was meant to simulate one of the more brutal realities of military service. Sometimes your ship pulls maneuvers that put enormous strain on your body, and if you black out or your skeleton fails at the wrong moment, people die. Standard protocol capped introductory cadet runs at 6 gravities. Advanced cadets after multiple successful sessions could be cleared up to 10, sometimes 12, for species with particularly robust skeletal structures like the Thracian or the Gorna Shai. The equipment itself, I should mention, had a hard-engineered maximum of 18 gravities, though nobody in the history of the vessel's operation had ever actually run it past 15. The safety systems built into the console would trigger automatic emergency deceleration at any reading the onboard medical sensors flagged as approaching a subject's individual fracture threshold, which, for most species, meant the system would never actually let the arm reach anywhere near the mechanical maximum. For Marcus Webb, based on my assessment, that automatic cutoff should have triggered somewhere around 8.5 gravities. I submitted my report to Commander Rook that evening. I recommended a cadet-specific safety cap of 5 gravities for the introductory run, with a note that Cadet Webb had verbally requested the opposite, an authorization to exceed the equipment's standard safety thresholds entirely. I fully expected this request to be denied, without discussion. Command staff on the Ascendant Compact did not, as a rule, entertain requests from cadets to override medical safety recommendations, and I assumed Commander Rook would file it as exactly the kind of overconfident nonsense you sometimes get from young officers who have not yet had their first serious injury to humble them. I was called to Commander Rook's office the following morning instead. Commander Thessaly Rook was Vontesh, a species I had worked alongside for most of my career, methodical people, tall, with a kind of layered chitinous plating along the forearms that coalition medical texts sometimes describe, slightly unfairly, as looking like stacked dinner plates. She had the reputation of being exceptionally by the book, which is why her question caught me off guard. "Dr. Voss," she said, "I've read your report on Cadet Webb. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one." "Of course, Commander. How confident are you in the 8-gravity threshold?" "Extremely confident," I said, and I meant it. "The fracture model is derived directly from his skeletal density scan, cross-referenced against established biomechanical failure points that are consistent across every vertebrate species we've cataloged. I would put my confidence at somewhere above 95%. And if I told you," she said, "that Cadet Webb is not the first human to make this exact request, that, I admit, surprised me. I wasn't aware of a pattern." There isn't much of one yet, she said. 11 months of data. But I've had 2 other human cadets on other assignments put in similar requests, push past the recommended cap, past the safety cutoff if possible. Both requests were denied by more cautious commanding officers before they could be tested. I want to know, off the record, whether you believe there's something to this, or whether you believe Cadet Webb is simply overconfident. I told her, honestly, that I believed he was overconfident, and that my model was correct, and that authorizing a run past 8 gravities without a hard safety cap represented an unacceptable risk of serious, possibly permanent, injury. Commander Rook was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I did not expect. I'm going to authorize a supervised extended run. Full medical monitoring. Full emergency response. Staged and ready, and I want you personally overseeing the diagnostics. But I'm removing the hard mechanical cap. Lol. If he wants to push it, we're going to let him push it. And we're going to have every instrument in this ship's medical bay watching when he does. Commander, with respect, I have to formally object to that decision. The risk of catastrophic skeletal failure above 8 gravities is noted, she said. Objection on record. We're proceeding anyway. I have thought about that conversation many times since. At the time, I believed Commander Rook was making a serious command error, the kind of decision driven by curiosity rather than caution, the kind that gets written up in incident reports with words like negligent and preventable. I know now that she was doing something else entirely. She was a career officer who had, in 11 months, developed a quiet, half-formed suspicion that everything the Coalition thought it knew about humans was built on models constructed for the wrong species, and she wanted to find out definitively, one way or the other, before that misunderstanding got someone killed in an actual combat scenario, rather than a training exercise. I did not understand that yet. I just thought she was reckless. The day of the test, Centrifuge Bay 3 was more crowded than I had ever seen it for what was, on paper, a routine introductory cadet exercise. Ward travels fast on a ship with a crew complement in the low thousands, and by the time we assembled, there were at least a dozen off-duty officers crowded along the observation gallery who had no official reason to be there and every unofficial reason in the galaxy. I set up my monitoring station directly adjacent to the control console, with a direct feed from the sensors embedded in Marcus Webb's flight suit, monitoring heart rate, blood oxygen, bone stress indicators along 6 major skeletal points, and a real-time fracture probability, model running continuously throughout the test. Chief Safety Officer Padron Yulish manned the primary controls, with Commander Rook standing just behind him, arms folded, watching the capsule at the end of the arm with an expression I could not quite read. Marcus Webb walked into the capsule wearing the standard flight suit, gave a small nod to the observation gallery, which several off-duty officers returned with what I can only describe as nervous enthusiasm, and settled into the restraint harness without any visible hesitation. Cadet Webb, Woolish said, over the comm. We are beginning the standard run at 2 gravities and increasing. Incrementally. You are authorized, per Commander Rook, to request an increase at any point beyond standard protocol limits, and you are equally authorized to call a halt at any point. Is that understood? Understood, came the reply, flat and calm, exactly the same tone he had used in my examination bay the day before. The arm began to rotate. I want to walk you through the numbers, because the numbers are, honestly, the entire story here, and I tracked every single one of them personally. At 2 gravities, all readings were within completely normal parameters. Heart rate elevated slightly, blood oxygen stable, no stress indicators anywhere along the skeletal monitoring points. This was expected. 2 gravities is barely a strain for most healthy adult humanoids. At 4 gravities, still nothing of note. Heart rate continued to climb, which was expected as the body worked harder to maintain circulation against the increased load. But every value remained comfortably within safe ranges. At 6 gravities, the standard cap for introductory cadets, ORs, paused the increase and checked in over comm. Cadet Webb, you have reached the standard training threshold. Do you wish to hold here or continue? Continue, Webb said. Dan, I watched my monitors very closely as we passed 6 and moved towards 7. This was the range where, according to my model, we should have started seeing early indicators. Microstress signatures. Along the femur and tibia, small elevations in the fracture probability estimate, the kind of early warning signs that would tell any experienced medical officer that we were approaching a genuine structural limit. Nothing appeared. At 7 gravities, I checked my instruments twice, assuming a calibration error. The stress indicators along all 6 monitored skeletal points remained flat, essentially unchanged from the readings at 2 gravities. His heart rate had climbed to a level I would expect from vigorous exercise, nothing more. Blood oxygen remained stable. At 8 gravities, the threshold I had personally certified as the point where we should expect the onset of spiral fracturing, I stared at my display and felt something that I can only describe, honestly, as the specific professional vertigo of watching your own expertise fail to describe reality. There was nothing. No stress indicator, elevation, no fracture probability increase. The model I had built, based on his own skeletal scan, was telling me that at 8 gravities, Cadet Marcus Webb's bones were experiencing approximately the same relative stress as a resting human standing on level ground. "Dr. Voss," Commander Rook said without turning from the capsule. "Status report." "All readings nominal," I said, and I remember my voice sounding strange even to myself, professionally hollow. The voice of someone reading numbers off a page they do not fully believe. "No stress indicators present. I am seeing no evidence of skeletal strain consistent with my pre-test model." "Continue the increase," she said. We passed 9 gravities. Then 10, the point at which most coalition species, even our more robust members, begin showing significant physiological strain, elevated stress signatures, visible discomfort, even through training discipline. Nothing changed in Marcus Webb's readings except his heart rate, which continued its slow, steady climb, the way anyone's would under sustained physical exertion, and his breathing, which the suit's internal microphone picked up as slightly labored but controlled, deliberate. The way you breathe when you are actively managing exertion, rather than being overwhelmed by it. At 11 gravities, Ulash's voice had lost some of its procedural flatness. "Cadet Webb, we are now well beyond standard advanced clearance thresholds for any species certified on this vessel. Confirm you wish to continue." "Confirmed," Webb said. "Continue." At 12 gravities, I stopped believing my own instruments entirely, which is a strange sentence for a physician to say out loud, but it is the truth. I ran a full diagnostic self-check on the medical sensor array, suspecting some kind of systematic failure, a sensor fault, a data feed corruption, something, anything, that would explain readings that contradicted 31 years of accumulated medical understanding about how skeletal systems respond to sustained mechanical stress. The self-check came back clean. Every sensor was functioning within calibration tolerance. The data was real. Commander Rook glanced at me at this point, and I remember the look on her face, a kind of grim, expectant patience, like someone watching a slow-motion collision they had already predicted and were simply waiting to see confirmed. "Doctor," she said, "diagnostic status." I looked at my tablet. I want to describe this moment precisely because it is the moment that everyone who has heard this story afterward asks me about, specifically TASCO. My diagnostic tablet, the same model used throughout Coalition, medical bays across dozens of vessels, standardized software, thoroughly tested, had begun flashing a single word across the top of the display, over and over, in the sharp red font reserved for readings that fall entirely outside the parameters the software is designed to interpret. Impossible. Not an error code. Not a technical fault message. The software itself, encountering data that fell so far outside every biological model it had been built to reference, had defaulted to what is essentially a plain language flag, meaning this result cannot be reconciled with any known physiological framework in the system's database. I had seen that flag exactly twice before in my career, both times due to genuine equipment malfunctions that were resolved within minutes by a hardware reset. This was not a hardware fault. I had already confirmed that. This was the medical monitoring system of a coalition warship looking directly at the intact, unfractured skeleton of a human cadet under 12 gravities of sustained force, and essentially throwing up its hands because it had no framework in which that made sense. 12 gravities holding steady, Ulish reported. Cadet Webb, status. I'm good, Webb said. There was strain in his voice now. Real strain, the sound of a body working hard against real resistance. But there was no panic in it. No pain, or at least, none that overrode his composure. Keep going. At 13 gravities, the observation gallery, which had been murmuring quietly among itself for the last several increments, went almost completely silent. I looked up briefly from my instruments and saw perhaps 20 off-duty officers of 6 different species standing absolutely still, watching the capsule at the end of the arm with the kind of stillness that comes from witnessing something your mind is not yet finished processing. 14 gravities, Ulish said, and his voice cracked very slightly on the second word. A small thing, barely noticeable, except that I had known Padre Ulish for 9 years and had never once heard his voice do that. Cadet Webb, this is now 3 gravities beyond the maximum load rating this equipment has ever been run to on this vessel in its operational history. I need explicit confirmation you wish to proceed. There was a pause. I watched the readouts, heart rate elevated but stable, blood oxygen holding, no stress indicators anywhere along the skeletal monitoring array. Proceed, Webb said. At 14 gravities, my diagnostic tablet stopped flashing the word impossible and simply froze entirely, the display locking on the last set of values it had received, as though the software itself had, in some very small digital sense, given up. Commander Rook stepped forward to the console. Hold here, she said. Hold at 14. I want a full 60 seconds sustained reading before we bring him down. Those 60 seconds were, I will tell you honestly, among the longest of my professional life. I stood there with a frozen tablet in my hands, listening to Marcus Webb breathe hard but steady through the calm, watching the arm continue its rotation at a speed that would have, I was completely certain the day before, reduced most coalition species to a mist of shattered bone and ruptured tissue. That I was watching the collapse of something much larger than a single medical assessment. At the 60-second mark, Commander Rook gave the order, bring it down. Gradual deceleration, standard protocol. The arm slowed. 2 gravities. 1. Then stillness and the soft hydraulic hiss of the capsule's restraint harness, releasing. I moved forward immediately, my diagnostic scanner already in hand, running toward the capsule with the specific urgency of a physician who fully expects to find a patient in critical condition, despite what the numbers had told me. Because 31 years of training does not simply switch off because a screen said something impossible. Marcus Webb climbed out of the capsule under his own power. He was breathing hard. His face was flushed, and there was a sheen of sweat across his forehead that told me his cardiovascular system had, at least, been genuinely taxed by the experience, which was some small comfort to my professional instincts. But he stood upright, unassisted, and when I ran my scanner across him, from skull to feet, systematically checking every major skeletal structure, I found exactly what the monitors had already told me I would find. Nothing. No fractures. No hairline cracks, no stress fissures, no microfractures along the load-bearing points, nothing. His bone density readings were within a small margin of measurement variance, identical to what they had been before he entered the capsule. How are you feeling, Cadet? I asked, and I am fairly certain my voice was shaking slightly, which is not something Threll physicians are known for. Little dizzy, he said. Otherwise, fine. Fine, I repeated. Yeah. Ha! I looked down at my scanner, at the clean, unremarkable skeletal readout of a man who had just spent 60 seconds under 14 gravities of sustained rotational force I had personally certified would begin causing catastrophic skeletal failure at just over half that number. And I understood, in that moment, that I did not actually know what a human was. I want to pause the narrative here and tell you what happened over the following 72 hours, because the aftermath of that test was, in its own way, just as strange as the test itself. Peter'd spread through the ship within hours the way it always does. By the following morning, I had received formal requests for my complete dataset from 3 separate coalition research divisions, none of whom had, as far as I knew, any prior interest in human physiology beyond the standard baseline surveys. By the second day, I had been contacted by someone from Coalition Central Command's Species Classification Office, a division most medical officers go their entire careers without hearing from directly, requesting a full briefing on what they termed the Webb anomaly. I did not enjoy being the center of that attention. I want to be clear about that. I had built my career on precision and reliability, and here I was, submitting a report that essentially amounted to my own professional model being wrong, by a margin so large it was difficult to describe in normal statistical language. But I submitted the report honestly because the alternative, fudging the numbers or downplaying the result to protect my own professional reputation, was not something I was willing to do. I had spent 31 years building a reputation for telling people the truth about their bodies. I was not going to stop, simply because the truth this time made me look like I did not know how to do my job. The report went into significant detail, and I will summarize the key findings for you here because I think they matter. First, and most immediately relevant, human skeletal architecture, while appearing structurally similar to several mid-tier coalition species on a standard density scan, does not respond to sustained load the way our existing biomechanical models predicted. Subsequent research, conducted over the following months by a joint team from 3 separate coalition medical institutions, would eventually determine that human bone possesses a property that our initial scanning technology had almost completely failed to account for. Human bone is not simply dense. It is, for lack of a more precise technical term that would mean anything outside a laboratory, exceptionally good at redistributing stress across its structure in real time, in a way that our models, built primarily around species whose skeletal systems are comparatively rigid and uniform, simply did not have a category for. It took the research team the better part of 4 months to properly characterize what they eventually termed adaptive load distribution, a property in which human long bones, under sudden or sustained mechanical stress, undergo microscopic structural reinforcement at the cellular level. Essentially strengthening themselves in direct response to the load being applied within certain time and intensity parameters. This is apparently related to something human physicians on their homeworld have understood for a very long time and refer to, with characteristic understatement, as bone remodeling, a process most human children experience through ordinary childhood activity, and most human athletes deliberately train through specific loading exercises. What none of us in the coalition medical community had understood, because we had never had reason to test it under the specific extreme conditions of a centrifuge exercise, was just how far that adaptive process could be pushed under acute, sudden loading conditions, particularly as the research team eventually theorized. Broadens in individuals from a species whose evolutionary history included millions of years of adaptation to a homeworld with gravity, roughly 9.5% higher than the Coalition Galactic Standard Reference gravity, a homeworld whose surface historical records would later confirm also included a staggering variety of dangerous terrain, unpredictable weather, and what one particularly blunt research summary described, without any apparent irony, as an evolutionary pressure environment among the most hostile documented in any coalition survey to date. Second finding, and this one honestly disturbed me more than the first. When I went back and reviewed the full dataset from Marcus Webb's initial pre-test scan, the scan I had used to build my original catastrophically wrong fracture model, I found that the scan itself had been accurate. His bone density really was what I had recorded. My error had not been in the measurement. It had been in the model I applied to that measurement, a model built entirely around species whose skeletal systems do not possess this adaptive property, and which therefore had no mechanism to predict a skeleton that could, in effect, actively reinforce itself in response to the exact stress that was supposed to be breaking it. I had not misread the data. I had correctly read the data through completely the wrong lens, and I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is the actual heart of this story, more than the specific number of gravities involved. I was not incompetent. I was applying a rigorous, well-tested, professionally sound methodology to a species that methodology had simply never been designed to account for. And I think that is exactly the kind of mistake an entire civilization can make, not through malice, not through active contempt, but through the quiet, reasonable assumption that the new species must work roughly the way the previously cataloged species work, until something forces you to discover, often in a fairly dramatic fashion. Third, and this is the finding that eventually reached well beyond medical circles into the broader question of human classification within the coalition. Marcus Webb was not, as it turned out, statistically exceptional among humans. This is the part that I think surprised command staff even more than the initial test result. In the weeks following the incident, at the direction of Coalition Central Command, 17 additional human cadets and enlisted personnel across 4 different vessels were given supervised centrifuge assessments, all under strict medical monitoring, and all with full informed consent given the now well-documented results of the Webb test. Of those 17, 14 exceeded 12 gravities without any skeletal stress indicators. 9 exceeded 14. 2, remarkably, reached the equipment's full mechanical maximum of 18 gravities before the tests were halted, not due to any sign of impending injury, but because command staff, at that point, had become deeply uncomfortable with the idea of simply continuing to increase the load on a human subject indefinitely to find some theoretical ceiling that none of the data suggested was coming anytime soon. I remember reading that summary report and thinking about every single interaction I had ever had with a human patient over the previous 11 months, every physical I had performed, every minor injury I had treated, every time I had, without really thinking about it. Mentally file the human patient under a durability classification that I now understood to be wrong by an order of magnitude I genuinely struggled to comprehend. Which brings me to Commander Rook, and the question I had been avoiding asking her since the day of the test, which I finally worked up the nerve to ask about a week after the initial incident, once the preliminary data had started coming in from the follow-up assessments. "Commander," I said, finding her in the officers' mess during a rare quiet moment, "I need to ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer since you asked the same of me before the test." "Go ahead, Doctor." "You authorized that test. Knowing my model predicted catastrophic failure, you overrode a formal medical objection to do it. I want to know why you were confident enough in the outcome to take that risk." She was quiet for a moment, turning a data tablet over in her hands, and when she answered, she did not look at me directly at first. "I wasn't confident," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that too. I did not know Cadet Webb's skeleton was going to hold at 14 gravities. If it had failed at 9, I would be sitting in a very different kind of meeting right now, possibly facing formal review for authorizing a test against direct medical recommendation. Then why authorize it at all?" She set the tablet down. "Because 11 months ago, before humans joined the coalition, I read through their preliminary survey files, the way every training commander did. And there was a section in there, buried in an appendix nobody reads, about human historical conflict data. Their wars, their expeditions into their own planet's most hostile environments, their survival statistics in situations that, on paper, should have been unsurvivable by any reasonable model." She paused. "I remember reading a specific account of a group of humans who climbed a mountain on their homeworld tall enough that the air itself becomes too thin to sustain consciousness for extended periods, using equipment that by any coalition engineering standard should be considered primitive. Multiple of them died doing this, and they kept doing it anyway, for what their own records describe, with what I can only interpret as genuine pride, as no practical reason at all beyond the fact that the mountain was there. I don't see how that translates to bone density projections, Commander." "It doesn't," directly she agreed, "but it told me something about how this species relates to limits. Every single account I read, across their entire history, followed the same basic pattern. Something is declared impossible, or too dangerous, or beyond reasonable capability, and a meaningful percentage of humans respond to that declaration, not with acceptance, but with an almost compulsive need to test it personally. I did not know Cadet Webb's skeleton would hold, but I had a strong suspicion that your 8-gravity threshold was built on a model calibrated for species that do not behave the way this one does, and I had an equally strong suspicion that if I denied his request, I would simply be delaying the exact same test under worse, less controlled conditions at some point during an actual combat scenario, where the stakes would be considerably higher than an uncomfortable conversation in a debrief. I did not have an immediate response to that. I still think about it fairly often. The final piece of the story, and the part that I think ties everything together, concerns what happened to Marcus Webb's official species classification file, and, by extension, the broader classification review that followed for humanity as a whole within coalition military doctrine. Every species inducted into the coalition receives what is formally called a physiological and tactical assessment classification, a lengthy document maintained by Central Command that informs everything from equipment design to combat doctrine to, yes, medical treatment protocols across every vessel and installation in coalition space. At the time of the centrifuge incident, humanity's classification, based on the initial 11-month-old survey data, listed their species under a designation that translates roughly to standard biological moderate resilience, a classification shared with a handful of other recently inducted species considered unremarkable from a durability standpoint, requiring no special handling protocols or combat doctrine adjustments. Following the centrifuge incident and the subsequent 17-person follow-up study, and frankly a fairly uncomfortable series of meetings at Central Command that I was asked to attend as the medical officer who had, in the words of one particularly blunt admiral, personally discovered the problem. I want to read you the language from the revised classification document because I think the shift in tone tells its own story. The original document described humans, in flat bureaucratic language, as possessing skeletal and muscular resilience within expected parameters for their approximate size and mass classification. The revised document, issued 4 months after the centrifuge incident, described humans as possessing, and I'm quoting directly here, an unusually robust adaptive physiological response to acute mechanical and environmental stress, likely originating from an unusually hostile homeworld evolutionary environment, with combat and operational doctrine recommendations updated accordingly to reflect substantially higher than average physical resilience thresholds across multiple stress categories. Buried in a footnote, added almost as an afterthought by someone at Central Command with, I suspect, a rather dry sense of humor, was a single line that eventually made its way into informal circulation across half the fleet. It read, simply, previous classification of fragile is withdrawn. See attached data. Recommend classification of exceptionally durable, tactical planning to account for the possibility of underestimation as a strategic liability. Weaponized was the word that started circulating unofficially among the officer corps within a few weeks, not as an official classification term, but as the kind of shorthand that spreads through a fleet faster than any formal memo. I heard it first from a junior officer in the mess hall, describing humans to a newly arrived cadet from another species, and I heard it many more times after that, always with a kind of wry, slightly nervous respect behind it. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with Marcus Webb before the Ascending Compact reassigned him to advanced training, because I think it closes this story better than any classification document could. I called him back into my examination bay about 3 weeks after the incident, ostensibly for a routine follow-up scan, though honestly I think I mostly wanted to talk to him again, to understand, if I could, what had actually been going through his mind that day. You're clear, I told him, after running the scan and confirming again that his skeletal readings were entirely unremarkable, which by that point had become the single strangest sentence I could say about a patient. No signs of stress fracture? Even microscopic. Whatever your body did in that centrifuge, it appears to have done it perfectly. Good to know, he said. I have to ask you something, cadet, and I want an honest answer. When you made that request to push past 8 gravities, past every safety cutoff, did you know your bones would hold, or were you simply willing to accept the risk? He thought about that for a moment longer than he had thought about most of my questions during our first conversation. Honestly, I wasn't sure. I've done some pretty intense physical stuff before. Training back home, some stuff in the reserves before I signed up for this program. I've had my body pushed hard enough that I had a decent feel for what it could take. Your model said 8. My gut said the model was probably wrong, based on stuff I'd felt my body do before that nobody had ever bothered to put a number on. That's a significant risk to take on a gut feeling. Maybe, he said. But doctor, with respect, I've read some of the history of how new species get treated when they first join up with bigger, older organizations like this one. Everybody gets measured against whatever baseline the last new species set. If I let you cap me at 5 gravities, because your model said that was safe, that number goes into a file somewhere, and that file follows every human who comes after me. Training officers, combat doctrine writers, people making decisions about what kind of missions humans get assigned to. They all read that file eventually, and they build their assumptions around it. I figured it was worth some risk to make sure that file said something true, instead of something convenient. I did not have a response to that immediately. I still think it is one of the more quietly remarkable things anyone has ever said to me in an examination bay. You could have been badly injured, I said finally. Permanently. Yeah, he agreed. I thought about that. But doctor, back home, we've got a saying. Something like, most of the worst mistakes in history happened because somebody let a wrong number sit in an official file for too long and everybody built on top of it before anybody bothered to check if it was true. He shrugged. In that particular human way, that seems to convey both humility and total conviction at the same time. Figured I'd rather be the one who checked. I have thought about that conversation more than almost any other conversation in my career, and I want to close this account with what I think is the actual lesson buried in it, because I do not think the lesson is simply that humans have unusually resilient bones, interesting as that fact certainly is. The lesson, I think, is about the quiet, reasonable, entirely well-intentioned way that institutions build permanent assumptions out of incomplete information, and how rarely anyone within those institutions is willing to personally test whether those assumptions are actually true, because testing them is expensive and risky, and can make a well-credentialed professional, like myself, look at least temporarily like they do not know what they are doing. I did not misread Marcus Webb's bones because I was careless or biased or bad at my job. I misread them because I applied a model that had never been properly tested against a species, and because nobody in 11 months of hurried classification work had thought to ask a simple, obvious question. What if the standard model is wrong for this one? It took one cadet, willing to accept genuinely significant personal risk, to force that question into the open, in a way that no amount of careful bureaucratic review probably ever would have. I retired from active fleet service 2 years after the centrifuge incident, and I want to tell you that in those 2 remaining years, I changed the way I practiced medicine considerably. I stopped trusting inherited baseline models as thoroughly as I once did. I started asking, for every new species I treated, not just what does the data say, but what assumptions is this data quietly built on top of, and have those assumptions actually been tested, or have they simply never been seriously challenged? Commander Rook, last I heard, was promoted to a senior training doctrine position at Central Command, where she has apparently become something of a quiet advocate for revising physiological assumptions across a number of newer member species, using, as she puts it, in the occasional briefing I still get invited to as a subject matter consultant. The Webb Standard, a phrase that has, I am told, become fairly widely used shorthand across training divisions for the general principle of actually testing your assumptions before you build doctrine on top of them. And Marcus Webb himself went on to complete advanced officer training with what his subsequent record describes as an entirely unremarkable series of further assessments. Unremarkable, that is, except for the fact that every single physical challenge presented to him across the remainder of his training career, every strength test, every endurance evaluation, every simulated combat stress scenario, produced results that fell somewhere between the high end of expected human performance and, in a handful of cases, results that training staff simply did not have an existing category for and had to create new benchmark categories to properly record. I saw him one final time about 6 months after the centrifuge incident at a ceremony marking the formal revision of Humanity's Coalition classification file, an event that, I will admit, drew a fairly unusual amount of Central Command attention for what was, on the surface, a rather dry bureaucratic occasion. He was standing near the back of the room looking, if I am honest, faintly embarrassed by the whole affair, The way I had come to understand was fairly typical of humans being publicly recognized for something they did not consider particularly boastworthy. I walked over and asked him how it felt, watching an entire civilization's official assessment of his species get rewritten because of a decision he made in an examination bay 6 months earlier. He thought about it for a moment. In that same unhurried way, he seemed to think about everything. And then he said something that I wrote down afterward, because I knew, even then, that I would want to remember it precisely. "Feels a little strange, honestly," he said. "I wasn't trying to prove anything about all of humanity that day, Doctor. I was just pretty sure my own bones could take more than 8 gravities, and I figured somebody ought to find out for certain instead of just writing down a guess and calling it science." "And if you'd been wrong," I asked, "then you'd have had one very broken cadet," he said, "and a data point that was still more useful than not knowing at all." I did not have a response to that, beyond a professional nod, that I hope conveyed at least some fraction of the respect I actually felt in that moment. I have spent 33 years now as a physician across 6 species and one very memorable centrifuge test that upended everything I thought I understood about the limits of a body under stress. And if there's one thing I took away from Cadet Marcus Webb, more than the specific fact of human bone density, more than the specific number 14, it is this: the most dangerous number in any medical file is not the one that turns out to be wrong. It is the one that nobody ever thinks to question. Sitting quietly in an official record, shaping decisions for years simply because it has never once been tested against the truth. We test it now, at least on my old vessel, whenever we possibly can. And every time we do, I think of a tall, unremarkable-looking cadet from a place called Minnesota, sitting calmly in an examination bay, telling me, without a trace of arrogance, that he thought my model was wrong. He was right. And I have never once regretted being proven wrong by someone who simply wanted the file to tell the truth.